Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026. Hello.
What's up, guys?
So today we're going to talk about hearings. Get excited.
Oh, hell yeah.
Specifically, the City of Huntsville and the Huntsville Housing Authority are holding public input hearings on a $400 million plan to redevelop Mill Creek. So these meetings include a resident drop-in open house on Wednesday, October 18th at 6 p.m. At the HHA Resident Services Building at 212 Seminole Drive, Southwest. There's a Johnson Tower resident meeting on Thursday, October 19th at 4 p.m. at the Johnson Tower resident space at 216 Seminole Drive, Southwest, and a neighborhood and resident meeting Thursday, October 19th at 6 p.m. at the Boys and Girls Club at 125 Earl Street. And we're going to be at the Thursday evening meeting. Right. So what do we know about this development? Well, from the 2021 draft plan, which was approved by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's going to be a mixed-use development. So that includes, basically, mixed use means it's not just retail or commercial. In this case, it'll be housing, retail, education, and nonprofits, from what the plan elaborates. And it will also be a mixed income. So whereas before, all the units were public and subsidized for low-income residents, this will include market rate housing, housing authority housing, workforce housing, and senior housing. So how many units of housing this will include is unclear to me. So the draft plan includes 1,500 units of housing, but some of them are going to be off-site. Now, I don't know why a plan for a particular site would include units that will not be on that site, but...
That is a bit strange.
Whatever. Then some reporting I saw said around 1,000 units, and then more recent reporting I saw says 750 units of housing. This is a classic thing that I would see in San Francisco all the time, where a project would have a certain number of units, and then as time would go on, the number of units would decrease and decrease, which is extremely unfortunate when we're in a housing supply crisis. So as far as the breakdown of, how much market rate versus housing authority versus workforce versus senior, that's also not decided yet. The plan calls for 15% public housing, 10% affordable non-public housing. Now, I don't know what that means. I know what it means to me. I would call this like naturally affordable housing. So this would be like housing that just costs less to build. But I don't know what the terminology in the plan, what it refers to. I'm very curious. With 75% market rate. Unclear. So what I really want to talk about today, though, is what is and was at the quote-unquote Mill Creek site. So essentially, the Mill Creek site was the site for a large concentration, probably the largest concentration, as far as I can tell, of public housing in Huntsville. Specifically, Butler Terrace, the Butler Terrace Addition, and Johnson Towers. Now, I found that the Butler Terrace Addition, at least, was built in the mid-50s and operated by the Huntsville Housing Authority. So this is just classic public housing. And if you want to know more about why it's not really feasible for subsidized housing to solve Huntsville's housing and homelessness crisis, please check out episode 9 of this podcast. This goes into why subsidized housing is actually more expensive than market rate housing to build. And since the whole problem is that market rate housing is too expensive, creating even more expensive housing is not gonna suffice. But go ahead.
Out of curiosity, is there a number on how many units of public housing they're destroying, essentially?
So, I think so. At one point, McGinnis said the city has demolished more than 100 units at Butler Terrace. I think I have, Irwin said about 100 residents were relocated from Butler Terrace Addition, which is set for demolition. That was true of 2022. As of 2019, I saw Butler Terrace and the Butler Terrace Addition contain 254 units. So that's the information I have.
And from most of the stats, like, so we're at the end of the day, most likely losing affordable housing units off of this, especially as time goes on from the sounds of it.
Yeah, I believe I would be very shocked if this did not result in a net loss of subsidized housing units. That's right. Okay. But even if it didn't, we don't have enough. And we didn't have enough before. So it's kind of neither here nor there. Like, we were in a deficit before, we're going to be in a deficit after.
Yeah.
It's going to be a worse deficit, but a dearth of public housing is not why we're in a crisis. A dearth of housing is why we're in a crisis. Okay. So, but this episode is really about how the story of Butler Terrace and Johnson Towers perfectly illustrates why cash assistance is a far better way to help needy families than subsidized housing. And this story begins with a colorless, odorless gas that is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. And that gas is called radon. So according to AL.com, public housing authorities across the country have refused to find and remove the radioactive gas from inside tenants' homes, leaving children, senior citizens, and other vulnerable people unnecessarily exposed. So this is a problem across the nation where HUD funds public housing that's run by local housing authorities, and neither HUD nor the local housing authorities give a fuck about whether these public housing units are exposing tenants to deadly gases. And the only reason we know this is because reporters spent a year doing independent testing, going into public housing units, surveying tenants, doing public records requests. Again, this is a year-long effort to figure out, one, that housing authorities are not testing on their own, even though the federal government has required them to do so. They're just breaking the law. And that even when they have information about unsafe levels of radon, they're not telling their tenants, and they're not doing anything to fix the problem. So Huntsville, as it turns out, is no exception. So in 2018, AL.com test found unsafe levels of radon in Huntsville's public housing, and reporters presented their results to Huntsville Housing Authority officials in 2019. So we know that as of February 2020, Huntsville Housing Authority officials knew Butler Terrace had a radon problem. In fact, half the Butler Terrace Addition units had elevated levels of radon. And since this was 2020, the residents couldn't leave their homes. So they're being poisoned in homes they're not allowed to leave.
Literally the worst possible time. Not even the worst possible, but the worst place to have to spend the pandemic, like in a bath of toxic gas.
Right. Which they had likely been bathing in for years. And Huntsville housing officials did not tell residents about the radon that they knew about. The residents found out when AL.com reporters told them. Quote, "Had you not come by, I would never have known," said one tenant who requested anonymity for fear of reprisal from housing officials. Jeez. All but one of the 8 residents one reporter spoke to requested anonymity for the same reason. So, Huntsville Housing Authority acting deputy executive director as of April 2020, Keisha Reich, I'm not sure, said most families impacted by radon would rather wait for neighborhood choice vouchers to relocate to a new home rather than what? According to former H4H guest Tia Turner, there are 700 families on the wait list for public housing in Huntsville right now. So I'm not completely sure what their alternative to sitting in a poisonous unit was, but apparently they quote unquote chose to do that. Reich said, any residents deciding to stay in their units, we're just encouraging them to open their windows, ventilate it, have as much airflow through the units, because that is how much that can mitigate some of the levels during this period. Thanks.
I don't even know what to say to that, honestly. Neat.
Someone at the HHA claimed to have asked the Department of Housing and Urban Development for immediate relief for families, but HUD does not view radon as an emergency. So, okay. That's kind of what happened. I want to talk about what could have happened instead. So we have not seen a similar crisis of private landlords not testing for radon or not mitigating radon in the private sector. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying there's a mechanism for this, which is it's really difficult, if not impossible, to sue city government.
Oh, yeah.
City governments and city government entities. So if I'm a private landlord and I'm not testing my units for radon, or I'm not mitigating radon or whatever, and my tenants sue me, like they can actually do that. If I'm a housing authority and my tenants are being poisoned by the housing that I'm maintaining, what am I going to do? Like, I know I can't be sued, so there's no incentive really other than being like a decent person, which systems should not rely on people being decent people. They should rely on incentives. So the incentive system is just very wrong. And so what should happen is we should be giving these families cash assistance, not vouchers, because there aren't enough vouchers to, first of all, there aren't enough vouchers. There's a wait list for vouchers. But in addition, there aren't enough landlords who are willing to take the vouchers to house everyone who needs a voucher. So even people who have vouchers often can't use them or have to live far away from jobs and family in order to find a place to live. So anyway, give people cash assistance. And then when they find out there's radon in their units, first of all, they're more likely to know because their landlords are likely to actually be testing for radon and mitigating it. But if they find their landlord isn't doing that, they can just move. They can move anywhere they can afford with their cash assistance. So,
yeah. Wow. I had not heard about any of this, but it's Jesus.
So instead of fixing the problem, in July 2022, the Huntsville City Council approved a resolution authorizing Mayor Battle to enter into a memorandum of agreement with the Huntsville Housing Authority to demolish Butler Terrace and Johnson Towers, which somehow also costs the city $200,000 as part of quote-unquote tipping fees. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Honestly, like $200,000 for a demolition of large, old buildings sounds not too expensive. So, but I don't know if that's in addition to the cost of the demolition, if like the fee was, I don't know. Anyway, I wish reporters would like actually spell things out. So supposedly, the city gave residents vouchers. We have information that more than 100 individuals and families were displaced out of the Butler Terrace addition. I don't know that all of those residents got vouchers. I haven't seen reporting that like verified that. And I'd really like to know where they went with the vouchers, because my understanding is, again, a lot of local landlords, the vouchers are for market rates, which, first of all, have increased a lot in recent years, and I wouldn't be surprised if the
exponentially
voucher values have not increased in tandem with market rate rents. So it may be below market rates, actually. But even if they were at or above market rate rents, a lot of landlords don't want to deal with the extra hassles associated with being a landlord that accepts Section 8 vouchers. And there's a lot of discrimination. A lot of landlords make negative assumptions about people who have housing vouchers, so don't want to accept those tenants for that reason. And so I would just be very surprised if all those residents have actually been adequately housed.
Yeah, whereas if you just gave them cash, then they could, actually just pay market rates. And yeah, if they were in a place, like you said, that was deemed uninhabitable, they could initiate legal action against their landlord, who is not a city government. They could move to another place. Yeah.
Right. So one of the more interesting things that I learned looking into this whole saga is that in 2014, Huntsville City Schools moved their school zone lines. So they changed which neighborhoods were zoned for which schools. And they did this because they were under a consent order from the Department of Justice to desegregate their school systems. So it's been illegal to have racially segregated schools in this country for several decades, but due to zoning and other mechanisms, many communities have school systems that are still essentially racially segregated. And so the Department of Justice has gone into certain communities that have racially segregated schools and put them under consent decrees to desegregate. So in 2014, Huntsville City Schools desegregated, removed their school zoning lines to desegregate, which meant that the kids who lived in Butler Terrace, which was majority Black, perhaps not surprisingly, they suddenly were zoned for majority white schools that had formerly been majority white, like Blossomwood and, they remained majority white, Blossomwood and Jones Valley Elementaries. Schools that served, according to one reporter at least, some of the most affluent neighborhoods in the district.
Oh, easily.
So 5 years post-rezoning, Jones Valley went from 6% Black to 26% Black, and Blossomwood went from 20% Black to 38% Black. How interesting that 6 years after the 6 years after the rezoning, we find out about the radon, and then 8 years post-rezoning, the public housing that had been zoned into the majority white wealthy schools are demolished and replaced with a mixed-use, mixed-income housing development. I'm not saying anything other than that's an interesting timeline.
That is a very interesting timeline.
The other thing I want to say is zoning is the main mechanism by which communities segregate their neighborhoods and schools by race and income. And our zoning code, our first zoning ordinance in Huntsville, was adopted right around the same time as the Civil Rights Act. And I think that this effort concentrating poverty in public housing is not a great idea. And this development is an effort to not just stop concentrating poverty by locating people of different levels of income in the same geographic area, but also to provide walkable retail and more density and services. And I think all that is good. At the same time, the reason that people of different races and levels of income are not currently living next to each other is our zoning ordinance. I'm not saying getting rid of zoning would just immediately fully integrate Huntsville, but it would go a long way if we got rid of the zoning that forces people out of certain wealthier, whiter areas who are browner and poorer. Like, they literally can't afford to live there. That would go a long way, obviously. And if we said, just because you're low income doesn't mean you can only live in certain areas where we've built public housing or where landlords will take your Section 8 vouchers, if we instead said, if you're low income, you have cash money and your money is as good as everybody else's, and you can live anywhere in the city you can afford. And we built naturally affordable housing throughout the city, we would integrate. It would be integrated. And so we could do this, and it doesn't need to cost $400 million, and it doesn't need to involve having the state be landlords, which they're obviously horrible landlords.
Yeah.
None of this is necessary.
Yeah.
This is not the smart way to do things. This is not only the dumb way, but the evil way to do things. So anyway, that's what I think about that. So we'll be at the meeting, excited to learn more, and I hope you show up, but I understand if you don't. That's the thing about having the state be a landlord, is that it requires people to, give up their Thursday evenings to go make sure that, the city makes the right choices. And it's like, that's just not an efficient use of anybody's time or energy. The people who make money being landlords should make those decisions, and the people who rent should have lots of high quality options to choose from.
In an ideal world, which Huntsville is not always.
No. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. See you next week.
And I'm just going to go through the list of meetings again, just for anyone interested. So you have the Resident Drop-In Open House on Wednesday. That's this Wednesday, October 18th at 6 p.m. at the HHA Resident Services Building at 212 Seminole Drive Southwest. On Thursday, you have two options. The Johnson Tower Resident Meeting. That's going to be at 4 p.m. at Johnson Tower, 216 Seminole Drive. And the one that we'll be at is going to be at 6 p.m. at the Boys and Girls Club at 125 Earl Street. But yeah, definitely show up to one, and we'll be at the Boys and Girls Club. But
bye.
Have a good week, guys. Thank you for tuning in to Housing for Huntsvillians. This podcast is a project of Huntsville New Liberals. Sign up for our newsletter and RSVP to our monthly happy hour at HuntsvilleNewLiberals.com.